The kitchen door slammed open so hard the glass rattled in its frame, and Victoria Ellsworth's voice cut through the marble hallway like a blade. "You actually think I'd let you walk through my front door looking like that? Take the service entrance, Lorraine. That's where people like you belong." Before we go further, hit that subscribe button. Follow this channel and stay with me until the very end. And in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from tonight, because I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Lorraine Harris stood in the doorway of the Ellsworth Mansion's kitchen with a mop bucket in one hand and a folded rag in the other, and for 3 full seconds she said nothing at all. The silence wasn't weakness. It was the silence of a woman who had learned decades ago exactly how loud silence could be when you knew how to wield it. "Good morning to you too, Mrs. Ellsworth." Lorraine finally said, her voice low and even, carrying just the faintest trace of something that used to fill arenas. Victoria didn't even look up from her phone. She was scrolling through photos of floral arrangements for the gala, her thumb flicking across the screen with the bored irritation of a woman who had never once in her life had to ask permission for anything. "Don't good morning me. The Hendersons are coming for brunch in 20 minutes, and the entry hall still smells like lemon polish. I don't pay you to make my house smell like a janitor's closet. You pay me to clean it," Lorraine said simply, setting the bucket down. "Lemon polish is what gets the brass railings clean." Victoria finally lifted her eyes, and there was something in them. Not quite hatred, something colder and more careless than hatred, the kind of contempt reserved for furniture that occasionally answered back. "I don't need the attitude, Lorraine. Do you have any idea how many women would kill for this job? Steady pay benefits, a house this size to work in. You should be thanking me every single morning you walk through that door." Lorraine picked the bucket back up. Her knuckles, weathered from 40 years of work, tightened just slightly around the handle. "I am thankful, Mrs. Ellsworth, for the work." It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the whole truth, and both women in that kitchen understood that gap perfectly, even if only one of them understood why it existed. Because what Victoria Ellsworth did not know, what nobody in that gleaming marble-floored mansion in Stamford, Connecticut had ever bothered to ask, because why would you ask the help about her past, was that the 61-year-old woman mopping her floors had once stood on the stage at Madison Square Garden in front of 20,000 screaming fans, had once held 3 Grammy Awards in her arms, while flashbulbs exploded around her like a galaxy collapsing, had once been called the voice of a generation by critics who wept openly in their reviews. Lorraine Harris. The name used to mean something. It used to fill stadiums. Now it filled mop buckets. She moved past Victoria without another word because that was the only way to survive a morning like this. You didn't argue, you didn't explain. You simply moved forward the way she had been moving forward for almost 20 years now, ever since the industry had decided she was finished. It happened so quietly that most people never even noticed. There was no scandal, no public fall from grace, no headline. Just a slow, deliberate erasure calls that stopped being returned a label, that quietly let her contract lapse radio stations, that mysteriously stopped playing her records right around the time she'd refused to sign away the rights to her own masters to a man who controlled half the industry. Gregory Ellsworth's name had been on that contract. Victoria's husband. The same man whose mansion Lorraine now cleaned for $19 an hour. Life had a cruelty to it sometimes that felt almost too precise to be coincidence. As Lorraine wrung out her mop in the laundry room, her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She wiped her hands on a towel before answering, glancing at the screen. It was Denise, her attorney, and one of the only true friends she had left from the old life. "Lorraine, you're not going to believe this," Denise said, her voice tight with something between disbelief and alarm. "Try me. Today's already been a special kind of morning. Victoria Ellsworth's office just called mine. They want to send you a formal invitation. To the gala. The big 1-300 guests, half the entertainment industry, news cameras, the whole production. Saturday night at the Belmont Estate in Greenwich." Lorraine stood very still, the towel forgotten in her hands. "Victoria invited me to her gala. That's what they said." Victoria Ellsworth, who screamed at me 20 minutes ago because the entry hall smelled too clean. The very same. Lorraine let out a short, humorless laugh and leaned against the dryer, feeling the vibration hum up through her spine. "Denise, that woman has never once asked me how I'm doing. She doesn't know my last name is Harris. I'd bet money on it. She calls me the help to her friends when she thinks I can't hear. And now she's inviting me to mingle with 300 of New York and Connecticut's elite. Amont des Pommes. I don't like it, Denise said flatly. Something about this feels wrong. People like Victoria don't have sudden attacks of generosity, Lorraine. You know that better than anyone. I know it better than most, Lorraine agreed quietly. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that carried weight. You're not actually thinking of going. Lorraine looked out the small laundry room window out across the manicured Ellsworth lawn that stretched toward a hedge maze nobody ever actually walked through. I think I'd very much like to know what's behind door number 1 before I decide anything. Lorraine, I'm not stupid, Denise. I know exactly what kind of woman Victoria Ellsworth is. I've spent 2 years cleaning up after her tantrums and her wine spills and her $1,000 shoes she leaves in random rooms like she's daring someone to trip on them. If she's inviting me to that gala, it isn't because she suddenly respects me. Then why even consider it? Lorraine was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. There was something underneath it now, something old and banked like coal that hadn't gone out, just gone cold on the surface. Because for 20 years, Denise, I have made myself small. I have made myself quiet. I have made myself invisible because it was easier than fighting a system that decided I didn't matter anymore. And every single morning, I have woken up and told myself that was wisdom. That survival mattered more than pride. She closed her eyes, but I'm tired of being wise. I think I might want to be seen again, even if it's dangerous. Lorraine, if this is some kind of trap, then I'll walk into it with my eyes open, Lorraine said. That's different from walking into it blind. After she hung up, Lorraine stood in that laundry room for a long while, the dryer rumbling beneath her, and she thought about a dress hanging in a garment bag in the back of her closet that she hadn't touched in 19 years. By the time Victoria found her again, sweeping the back terrace where the Hendersons would soon be sipping mimosas, Lorraine had composed herself completely. No trace of the conversation with Denise remained on her face. There you are, Victoria said, walking out in a silk robe, a glass of orange juice in her manicured hand. Listen, I have wonderful news for you. Is that so? Lorraine kept sweeping. I'm inviting you to my charity gala on Saturday. Isn't that kind of me? Victoria's smile was bright performative. It's a black tie event. 300 guests. Very important people, Lorraine. The kind of people who actually matter in this world. I just thought, well, I thought it might be nice for you to see how the other half lives just for one night. There it was. Lorraine had heard enough fake kindness in her life to recognize its exact temperature, and this was ice dressed up as warmth. That's very generous of you, Mrs. Ellsworth, Lorraine said, her voice carefully neutral. Isn't it? Victoria sipped her juice. I do love giving people experiences they'd never get otherwise. You'll have to find something appropriate to wear, of course. I know that might be a stretch on your budget, but I'm sure you'll manage something. What Victoria did not say, what she believed she was being clever enough to keep entirely private, was the text message she had already sent to her group chat of 6 friends not 10 minutes earlier. You guys are not going to believe what I'm doing for entertainment Saturday. Wait till you see who's coming as my special guest. This is going to be the funniest thing any of you have ever witnessed. Lorraine didn't need to see that message to know somewhere deep in her bones that it existed. I'll see what I can find, Lorraine said. Wonderful. Victoria turned to walk away, then paused, glancing back with something almost like genuine curiosity flickering behind her eyes. You know, it's funny. There's something about you, Lorraine. Sometimes when you're humming while you work, it almost sounds like you actually know what you're doing. She laughed again, that hollow sounded. Anyway, Saturday, don't be late, and try to look presentable. I do have a reputation to maintain. She walked back inside, leaving Lorraine alone on the terrace with a broom in her hands and 20 years of buried fire beginning very slowly to catch. That night after her shift, Lorraine drove home through streets that grew narrower and humbler the further she got from Greenwich, until she reached the small apartment building where she'd lived for 9 years. The kind of building where the radiators clanked in winter and the neighbors knew each other by first name. She made tea. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time without drinking it. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her daughter, Michelle, calling from Hartford. Mama, you sound strange, Michelle said the moment Lorraine picked up. What happened? Nothing happened, baby. I'm fine. You don't sound fine. You sound like you're standing on the edge of something. Michelle's voice softened. Talk to me. So Lorraine told her about the invitation, about Victoria's bright, careless cruelty, about the gold microphone Victoria had apparently dug up from some old charity auction, a detail Denise had managed to learn through a contact who worked event logistics for the Belmont estate. About the dress in the closet. There was a long silence on the line. Mama Michelle finally said, "You don't have to prove anything to those people." "I know that." "Then why does it sound like that's exactly what you're about to do?" Lorraine wrapped both hands around her mug, feeling the warmth seep into fingers that had spent the day in cold mop water. "Because I've spent 20 years telling myself I didn't need to prove anything, Michelle. And somewhere along the way, not needing to prove anything turned into not believing I had anything left to prove. There's a difference between peace and surrender. I think I confused the two for a very long time. And now I think I want to find out which one I actually chose." Michelle didn't try to talk her out of it after that. She knew her mother well enough to recognize when a decision had already settled into her bones, the way decisions used to settle right before Lorraine walked onto a stage calm and unshakable no matter how loud the crowd screamed. "I'm driving down Saturday," Michelle said instead. "I'm not missing this." "Michelle, you don't need to." "Mama, I'm driving down." Lorraine smiled for the first time all day. "Okay, baby." After they hung up, Lorraine finally opened the hallway closet she'd been avoiding for years. There, behind winter coats and a vacuum cleaner she rarely used, hung a garment bag, slightly yellowed at the seams, smelling faintly of cedar and thyme. She unzipped it slowly, her hands trembling just slightly, and there it was. The emerald green gown beaded along the bodice, the fabric still holding its shape after all these years, like it had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. She held it up against herself in the hallway mirror, and for a moment, just at a moment, she didn't see a 61-year-old cleaning lady standing in a cramped apartment hallway. She saw a flicker of the woman who used to walk out onto stages that shook with the screams of 20,000 people. She saw a flicker of Lorraine Harris. "Saturday," she whispered to her own reflection, her voice barely audible, more breath than sound. "Saturday, we'll see exactly who's laughing." The days that followed moved with a strange, charged quiet, the kind of stillness that exists right before weather changes. Victoria, true to form, mentioned the invitation to absolutely everyone who would listen, her hairdresser, her tennis partner, even the mailman, each time with that same bright, performative laugh, each time framing it as an act of extraordinary generosity. "I'm bringing my cleaning lady to the gala this year," she told her book club on Tuesday, swirling her wine glass with theatrical satisfaction. "I just think it's important to give back, show people a different world for one night." Her friend Pamela, sitting across the table with her own glass of Chardonnay, leaned in conspiratorially. "Victoria, you're not actually planning something, are you? I know that look." Victoria's smile widened just slightly. "I might have a little surprise planned, nothing cruel, obviously, just memorable. You know how my parties get talked about for months afterward. I like to give people something to remember." "What kind of something?" "You'll see Saturday." Victoria's eyes glittered with anticipation. "Let's just say Gregory finally let me dig something interesting out of his private collection. An old microphone. Some forgotten singer donated it to a charity auction years ago, and Gregory snapped it up for almost nothing, because nobody remembered who she even was. Gold-plated, very dramatic looking. I'm going to use it as part of the entertainment." "Entertainment? How?" Victoria laughed, that same hollow sound she always made when she found her own cleverness particularly delicious. "I'm going to ask Lorraine to sing for everyone. Can you imagine the poor woman scrubbing toilets all week, suddenly handed a microphone in front of 300 people who actually matter? She'll either freeze up completely or embarrass herself so badly nobody will ever forget it. Either way, it's going to be the highlight of the night." What Victoria had no way of knowing, what not even Gregory himself fully grasped since the auction records from 12 years ago had been filed under a name that meant nothing to him at the time he acquired the piece, was that the forgotten singer whose microphone he'd purchased for almost nothing was the very same woman his wife intended to humiliate with it. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony sharper than anyone in that mansion could possibly have anticipated. Meanwhile, in her small Stamford apartment, Lorraine spent her evenings in quiet preparation that had nothing to do with hairstyles or jewelry and everything to do with something far more internal. She practiced scales softly in her kitchen, late at night, her voice rusty at first, cracking in places it never used to crack, the years of silence having left their mark on muscles that once knew exactly how to hold a note for 30 seconds without trembling. But slowly, day by day, something began to return. Not the full voice, not yet, but the shape of it, the memory of it living inside her bones. She called Raymond Carter, a name she hadn't dialed in nearly 15 years, a man who had once been her producer and her closest friend in an industry that rarely allowed for either. "Lorraine Harris," Raymond said when he picked up, disbelief and warmth tangled together in his voice. "I thought you disappeared off the face of the earth." "I did," Lorraine said simply, "but I think I might be ready to come back. Just for one night. What's going on?" So she told him everything. The gala, Victoria, the microphone, the one she now suspected with a growing sinking certainty might be the very one she'd lost touch with 19 years ago, when her old management company liquidated its assets, without telling her, selling off pieces of her career, like furniture at an estate sale while she was too broke and too tired to fight it. Raymond went quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. "Lorraine, do you understand what you're describing, Gregory? Ellsworth was on the board of Sentinel Records back when your contract lapsed. He was one of the men who pushed your masters into that liquidation sale." Lorraine's grip tightened on the phone. "I know." "You know?" "Oh, I've known for years, Raymond. I just never had the energy to do anything about it. Knowing and fighting are two very different things when you're trying to keep the lights on. And now, Lorraine said, her voice steadying into something that hadn't existed in it for 2 decades, "I think the lights are about to come back on one way or another." Raymond exhaled slowly. "I'm coming to that gala, Lorraine. I don't care if I have to buy my way in. I'm not letting you walk into that room alone." "I was hoping you'd say that." Saturday arrived with a kind of inevitability that felt almost physical, like weather rolling in from the coast. Lorraine stood once more in front of her hallway mirror. The emerald green gown finally settled against her shoulders, fitting almost exactly as it had 19 years before, a small miracle she chose not to question too closely. Michelle had arrived an hour earlier, sitting on the edge of the bed watching her mother get ready. With tears, she kept blinking back. "You look like you used to look, Mama," Michelle whispered. "In the old photographs." Lorraine looked at her own reflection for a long moment, and for the first time in 20 years, she did not see invisibility staring back at her. She saw Lorraine Harris. "Whatever happens tonight," Lorraine said quietly, more to herself than to her daughter, "I am done being quiet." She drove to Greenwich alone, just as she'd insisted, with Michelle following 20 minutes behind, under Raymond's instructions to wait near the gate until given a signal. The old Honda rattled along winding estate roads, past iron gates and hedges trimmed into shapes too perfect to be natural, until the Belmont estate rose ahead like something out of a dream she'd had a long time ago and mostly forgotten. Valets in white gloves waved forward a line of cars gleaming under the entrance lights. A silver Bentley, a matte black Rolls-Royce, 2 identical Range Rovers belonging to people who clearly hadn't spoken in years, but still bought the same car out of habit. Lorraine pulled her Honda into that line, and she felt the shift in atmosphere immediately, the way the air itself seemed to grow colder. A valet approached her window, his polite smile faltering slightly as he took in the car, then recovering with practiced professionalism. "Evening, ma'am. Are you here for the event?" "I am," Lorraine said, stepping out before he could finish deciding whether to open her door for her. Behind her, she heard laughter, not loud, not pointed exactly, but unmistakable. 2 women in their 40s, dressed in gowns that cost more than Lorraine's monthly rent combined, exchanged a glance and a whisper as they passed. "Is that? Did she drive herself in that?" Lorraine didn't turn around. She had spent 40 years learning how to walk past whispers without letting her shoulders fall, and that particular skill, at least, had never left her, even after everything else had been stripped away. Inside the ballroom unfolded like something built specifically to remind people of their own smallness. Soaring ceilings strung with crystal, a string quartet playing something light and forgettable in the corner, waiters moving silently between clusters of guests with trays of champagne, catching the light like liquid gold. Lorraine stood at the entrance for a moment, taking it in, feeling the old familiar pull of a room built for spectacle. Victoria spotted her almost immediately, weaving through the crowd in a shimmering silver gown, a delighted predatory smile already forming. "Lorraine, you made it," her voice carried deliberately across several nearby clusters of guests. "Everyone, this is Lorraine. She's my cleaning lady. Isn't that wonderful? I thought it would be so meaningful to bring her tonight." The reaction rippled outward exactly as Victoria had hoped. Polite, confused smiles, raised eyebrows. Someone near the bar murmured something to their companion, and both laughed quietly into their drinks. "How charitable of you, Victoria." said a thin, silver-haired woman, holding a martini glass like a weapon. Truly, giving the help a night out. I do try to give back, Victoria said, practically glowing with self-satisfaction. Lorraine kept her expression perfectly calm, her hands folded in front of her, the emerald gown catching the chandelier light in ways that made more than one person glance twice, though none of them registered what they were actually seeing, not yet. Come, come, Victoria said, looping her arm through Lorraine's with theatrical warmth, steering her further into the room like a tour guide showing off an exhibit. I want everyone to meet you properly. For the next hour, Victoria paraded Lorraine from cluster to cluster, introducing her each time with the same phrase, my cleaning lady, watching with undisguised delight as guest after guest offered some variation of polite, condescending surprise. A man in his 60s asked Lorraine with genuine curiosity whether she'd ever considered getting into catering, since you clearly have a good eye for presentation. A woman complimented her on how well-spoken she was, as though that itself were the surprise. Lorraine absorbed every comment without flinching, filing each one away with the quiet patience she'd used for 2 decades to survive far worse. Somewhere across the room, she caught sight of Raymond Carter, arriving dressed sharply, scanning the crowd until his eyes found hers. He gave the smallest possible nod. Not yet, it said. Wait. Then Victoria clinked a small spoon against her champagne flute, and the string quartet fell silent, and the entire ballroom turned toward a small raised platform near the center of the room, where a single spotlight illuminated a velvet pedestal. Friends, Victoria announced, her voice carrying easily now that she had the room's full attention. Before dinner, I wanted to share something special with all of you. She gestured, and an assistant wheeled out a glass display case. Inside it, gleaming under the spotlight, sat a gold microphone, ornate and unmistakably custom-made, the kind of object that had clearly once meant something to someone. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Lorraine's breath caught in her throat. She knew that microphone. She would have known it in absolute darkness by touch alone after everything. This belonged to some singer from years and years ago. Victoria continued breezily, completely unaware of the tremor that had just passed through the woman standing a few feet from her. Gregory picked it up at auction ages ago, practically for nothing, since nobody even remembered who she was. And I thought tonight, since I have my own little Cinderella story here. She gestured at Lorraine, drawing scattered laughter. Wouldn't it be just delightful if Lorraine gave us a song, a little entertainment before dinner? The laughter sharpened, no longer bothering to disguise itself. Someone near the back called out, "Oh, this should be good." Someone else snapped a photo, already composing the caption in their head. Victoria turned to Lorraine with that same bright, cruel smile, lifting the microphone from its case and extending it toward her like a dare. Well, don't be shy. Sing for us. Or, she let the pause hang deliberately, savoring it. I suppose you could just leave. Whatever's easier for you. 300 faces turned toward Lorraine Harris. Cameras lifted, phones angled. The ballroom held its breath, waiting for the punchline they'd all been promised. Lorraine looked at the microphone in Victoria's outstretched hand. She looked at the sea of expectant, mocking faces surrounding her. She looked briefly across the room at Raymond, who gave her the smallest, steadiest nod. Now. And then Lorraine Harris stepped forward, and the room had no idea, not one single person standing beneath those crystal chandeliers, that they were about to witness something none of them would ever be able to forget for the rest of their lives. Part 2, lưu ý Việt đủ 4.000 đến 4.500 từ, liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc, chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động, cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần tiếp đạt điểm 10/10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh, sửa lỗi AI, kể theo ngôi thứ 3 tăng độ. Kịch tính không viết lần mạn, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong một tin nhắn không nhảy sang mức document mời. 2 đến 3 phút cần có mini climax và đặt 10 đến 15 mini climax mỗi. Phán cử 10 đến 12 phút. Có một twist lớn sâu sắc đan xen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn. Tăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật, thêm nhịp điệu, kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8 đến 10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả, thêm đánh dấu thời gian. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh, không có phần gạch trong bài viết văn bản, phù hợp với TTS. Và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh nha. Show more. Lorraine's fingers closed around the gold microphone, and the moment her skin touched the metal, something in her chest cracked open like a dam that had held back 20 years of silence. She felt the weight of it first. The exact weight, the exact balance, the precise spot near the base where the metal had been worn slightly smoother by her own grip night after night 2 decades ago on 100 different stages. Her thumb found that worn spot without even trying, the way a hand remembers a doorknob in a childhood home it hasn't visited in 30 years. Victoria stood beside her arms crossed, eyebrows arched in gleeful anticipation, already half turned toward her friends as if to say, "Watch this, this is the part you're going to want to remember." "Whenever you're ready," she said, and there was no warmth in it at all now, just the thin, brittle excitement of a woman watching a trap close exactly the way she'd designed it. The string quartet had gone silent. 300 guests stood frozen in a kind of expectant hush, the particular hush of people who believe they are about to witness something humiliating and don't want to miss a second of it. Somewhere near the back, a man chuckled under his breath. A woman near the bar lifted her phone higher, angling for a better shot. Lorraine closed her eyes. She thought of her mother's kitchen in Detroit, the radio always tuned to gospel on Sunday mornings. She thought of the first time she'd sung in front of strangers 11 years old, terrified, her voice cracking on the high note, and the whole congregation laughing kindly, encouragingly. She thought of Madison Square Garden, 20,000 voices screaming her name back at her until the sound became a physical thing she could lean against. She thought of the silence that came after. 19 years of silence. And then she opened her eyes, lifted the microphone, and sang. The first note left her mouth soft, almost hesitant, barely louder than a whisper. And yet it cut through that vast marble ballroom like a blade through silk. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be loud. It was control pure and absolute, the kind of control that only comes from 40 years of knowing exactly what your own voice is capable of. The laughter near the back died instantly. The woman with her phone lowered it slightly, her mouth falling open. Victoria's smile, frozen mid-formation, began to slip. Lorraine let the note build slowly, deliberately, climbing through the lower register with a richness that seemed to vibrate the very air in the room. She wasn't performing anymore. She was remembering. Every word that left her was a door creaking open after 2 decades locked shut, and behind that door stood the woman she used to be, the woman the industry had tried to erase, the woman who was apparently still very much alive inside this 61-year-old body that had spent the last 2 years on its knees scrubbing other people's floors. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. A man near the front set down his champagne glass so abruptly it nearly tipped over. "Oh my God!" Someone whispered the words, carrying further than they probably intended. "Oh my God, that's..." Lorraine's voice climbed higher, fuller now, filling every corner of that soaring ceiling, bouncing off crystal chandeliers that had never in their existence carried a sound this powerful. She felt her own chest opening with it, felt muscles she hadn't used in this exact way in 19 years, remembering almost violently how to work together again. There was pain in it, an actual physical pain, her throat protesting the demand after years of disuse, but she pushed through it because some pains were worth pushing through, and this was one of them. Victoria's mouth had gone completely slack. The triumphant gleam in her eyes had curdled into something closer to confusion, then alarm, then something that looked dangerously close to fear. "What is happening?" Victoria muttered under her breath, so quietly that only the woman standing closest to her caught it. "What is this? Isn't..." By the second verse, an elderly man near the front of the crowd, silver-haired, dressed in a tuxedo that looked like it had been tailored sometime in the previous century, rose unsteadily from his seat, his hand pressed flat against his chest, tears already streaking down his weathered face. "I saw her," he said, his voice trembling loud enough now that heads turned toward him. "I saw her sing this exact song. 1980? God, it must have been 1996, Madison Square Garden. I was there with my wife. She's gone now, God rest her, but I was there." "What are you talking about, Harold?" the woman beside him hissed, gripping his arm. "It's her," Harold said louder now, pointing a trembling finger toward the small stage. "It's her. That's Lorraine Harris. That's, my God, that's Lorraine Harris standing right there." The name moved through the crowd like an electric current, person to person, faster than anyone could have controlled it. Lorraine Harris. Lorraine Harris. The whisper multiplied, doubled, tripled, until it wasn't a whisper anymore but a murmur rolling across 300 stunned faces, and Lorraine kept singing through all of it, her eyes closed now, lost somewhere between the woman she'd become and the woman she'd buried. Victoria's hand flew to her own throat. That can't be. She turned to her friend Pamela, eyes wide with something that had gone well past confusion into genuine panic. Pamela, who is she? Do you know who this is? Pamela was already pulling up something on her phone, her thumb scrolling frantically. Her face went pale. She turned the screen toward Victoria without a word, and Victoria looked down at a photograph Lorraine Harris, decades younger, standing on a stage in Madison Square Garden, in an emerald green gown, 3 Grammy Awards lined up on a table beside her, the exact same gold microphone clutched in her hand. The exact same dress Lorraine was wearing right now. The exact same microphone Lorraine was holding right now. Victoria's entire face drained of color. No, she whispered. No, that's not possible. She's the cleaning lady. She cleans my house. She's not. But the proof was standing 6 feet away from her but was soaring through a ballroom that had gone completely utterly silent except for the sound she was making, a sound so pure and so devastating that grown men in tuxedos were openly weeping, a sound that seemed to be pulling something out of every single person in that room they hadn't even known they'd buried. Lorraine reached the final chorus, and she let her voice climb to its full, terrifying height, the note hanging in the air like something tangible, something you could almost reach out and touch. And the entire ballroom seemed to lean forward as one body drawn toward her, the way iron filings are drawn toward a magnet. When the final note finally faded, when Lorraine lowered the microphone and opened her eyes, there was a silence so complete it felt like the room itself had stopped breathing. And then it broke. The applause started slowly, one person, then another, then the entire room rising to its feet in a wave that crashed through the ballroom like thunder. People who had been laughing at her 20 minutes earlier were now standing, hands pressed to their mouths, tears streaming freely down faces that had been carefully composed into polite condescension just moments before. Phones that had been raised to capture humiliation were now raised to capture something else entirely, a resurrection, happening in real time in front of 300 witnesses. Lorraine Harris, someone near the front shouted, and the name spread through the crowd again, this time not as a whisper but as something closer to a chant. Victoria stood frozen in the middle of it all, her silver gown suddenly looking cheap and forgettable, next to the woman she'd spent the entire evening humiliating, her carefully constructed joke collapsing around her in real time, with 300 witnesses and at least a dozen phone cameras recording every second of her unraveling. Victoria started, then stopped, then tried again, her voice climbing towards something close to hysteria. There's been some kind of misunderstanding. I had no idea. I would never have, wouldn't you? The voice came from behind her, calm and steady, and Victoria spun around to find Raymond Carter standing there dressed sharply, his expression carved from something hard and unforgiving. Excuse me, do I know you? Victoria demanded, though her voice had lost most of its earlier authority. Raymond Carter, he said, I produced 3 of Lorraine's Grammy-winning albums. I've known this woman for 30 years, and I think it's time this room learned exactly why Lorraine Harris ended up cleaning houses for a living in the first place. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd, mixed now with something sharper. Curiosity, suspicion, the particular hunger of 300 wealthy people who had just realized they were standing at the edge of a much bigger story than they'd expected. Raymond, this isn't the time, Lorraine said quietly, lowering the microphone, but Raymond shook his head. It's exactly the time, Lorraine. You've spent 20 years being quiet. I'm done watching you do that. He turned back to the crowd, raising his voice so it carried to every corner of the ballroom. Does anyone here know who sits on the board of Sentinel Records? Does anyone here know who pushed through the liquidation of Lorraine Harris's masters 19 years ago, stripping her of royalties she should still be collecting to this day? Silence. Gregory Ellsworth, Raymond said, letting the name hang in the air like a verdict. Victoria's husband, the man who built half his fortune off contracts he gutted from artists who didn't have the resources to fight back. Lorraine Harris was one of them. Gasps rippled through the crowd, a second time sharper now, more pointed. Several guests turned instinctively toward the entrance where Gregory Ellsworth himself had just arrived fashionably late, as always still in the process of removing his overcoat, completely unaware of the storm he was walking into. What's going on in here? Gregory called out, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life walked into a room and felt unwelcome. 300 faces turned toward him in unison. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth, and Lorraine Harris, standing in the center of that stage with a gold microphone still warm in her grip, in a room full of strangers staring at her like she'd just stepped out of their collective memory, watched as the man who had quietly destroyed her career 2 decades earlier walked straight into the very room where his own wife had just resurrected the very woman he'd spent 19 years trying to make sure the world forgot. Gregory's smile faltered the moment he registered the silence, the stares, the phones angled toward him instead of away. "Victoria," he said, slowly scanning the room. "What exactly did I miss?" Nobody answered him at first. The silence stretched heavy and electric until Raymond Carter stepped forward, positioning himself directly between Gregory and the small stage where Lorraine still stood. "You missed quite a bit, actually," Raymond said. "Why don't you come up here and say hello to an old friend, Gregory? I think you two have some history worth discussing in front of all these very important people you've spent your whole career trying to impress." Gregory's eyes finally landed on Lorraine, really landed on her. Taking in the emerald gown, the gold microphone, the face he hadn't seen in person in 19 years, but recognized instantly, the recognition crashing across his features like a wave hitting rock. "Lorraine," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the single syllable, all his earlier confidence draining out of him in real time. "Lorraine Harris." "Hello, Gregory," Lorraine said quietly, her voice carrying easily through the silent ballroom. "It's been a long time." The crowd shifted, sensing the temperature in the room dropping even further, sensing that whatever was about to happen next was going to be far more devastating than anything Victoria had originally planned for the evening. Victoria looked between her husband and the woman she'd invited as a joke, her face cycling rapidly through confusion, dawning horror, and something that looked dangerously close to panic. "Gregory, you know her. You actually know her." Gregory didn't answer. He couldn't seem to find words at all, standing frozen near the entrance of his own gala, while 300 guests watched the color drain entirely from his face. "Why don't you tell your wife how you know me, Gregory?" Lorraine said, her voice steady despite the storm building visibly behind her eyes. "Why don't you tell this entire room exactly what happened to my masters 19 years ago? Tell them about the contract clause you buried on page 47 that nobody bothered explaining to me until it was already too late to fight it. Tell them about the calls that stopped coming the month after I refused to sign away my publishing rights for a fraction of what they were worth." "Lorraine, that's not," Gregory started, his voice strangled. "Tell them," Lorraine repeated, and something in her tone made the entire room go even quieter if such a thing were possible. Gregory opened his mouth, closed, it opened it again. The silence stretched unbearably. 300 guests holding their collective breath, waiting to see whether the man who had built an empire on careful, polished silence would finally be forced to speak the truth out loud in front of every single person whose respect he had spent his entire career carefully cultivating. And in that frozen electric moment, with cameras still rolling and Victoria's careful little joke now lying in ruins around her silver heels, nobody in that ballroom had any idea just how much further this night was about to unravel, or how many more secrets were about to come spilling out before dinner was ever served. Lorraine's fingers closed around the gold microphone, and the moment her skin touched the metal, something in her chest cracked open like a dam that had held back 20 years of silence. She felt the weight of it first, the exact weight, the exact balance, the precise spot near the base where the metal had been worn slightly smoother by her own grip night after night 2 decades ago on 100 different stages. Her thumb found that worn spot without even trying. The way a hand remembers a doorknob in a childhood home it hasn't visited in 30 years. Victoria stood beside her, arms crossed, eyebrows arched in gleeful anticipation, already half turned toward her friends as if to say, "Watch this. This is the part you're going to want to remember." "Whenever you're ready," she said, and there was no warmth in it at all now. Just the thin, brittle excitement of a woman watching a trap close exactly the way she'd designed it. The string quartet had gone silent. 300 guests stood frozen in a kind of expectant hush, the particular hush of people who believe they're about to witness something humiliating and don't want to miss a second of it. Somewhere near the back, a man chuckled under his breath. A woman near the bar lifted her phone higher, angling for a better shot. Lorraine closed her eyes. She thought of her mother's kitchen in Detroit, the radio always tuned to gospel on Sunday mornings. She thought of the first time she'd sung in front of strangers 11 years old, terrified, her voice cracking on the high note, and the whole congregation laughing kindly, encouragingly. She thought of Madison Square Garden, 20,000 voices screaming her name back at her, until the sound became a physical thing she could lean against. She thought of the silence that came after. 19 years of silence. Then she opened her eyes, lifted the microphone, and sang. The first note left her mouth soft, almost hesitant, barely louder than a whisper, and yet it cut through that vast marble ballroom like a blade through silk. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be loud. It was control, pure and absolute, the kind of control that only comes from 40 years of knowing exactly what your own voice is capable of. The laughter near the back died instantly. The woman with her phone lowered it slightly, her mouth falling open. Victoria's smile, frozen mid-formation, began to slip. Lorraine let the note build slowly, deliberately climbing through the lower register with a richness that seemed to vibrate the air itself. She wasn't performing anymore. She was remembering. Every word that left her was a door creaking open after 2 decades locked shut, and behind that door stood the woman. She used to be the woman the industry had tried to erase, the woman who was apparently still very much alive inside this 61-year-old body that had spent the last 2 years on its knees scrubbing other people's floors. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. A man near the front set down his champagne glass so abruptly it nearly tipped over. "Oh my God!" Someone whispered the words, carrying further than they probably intended. "Oh my God, that's..." Lorraine's voice climbed higher, fuller now, filling every corner of that soaring ceiling, bouncing off crystal chandeliers that had never once carried a sound this powerful. She felt her own chest opening with it, felt muscles she hadn't used in this exact way in 19 years, remembering almost violently how to work together again. There was pain in it, actual physical pain. Her throat protesting the demand after years of disuse, but she pushed through it because some pains were worth pushing through, and this was one of them. Victoria's mouth had gone completely slack. The triumphant gleam in her eyes had curdled into something closer to confusion, then alarm, then something that looked dangerously close to fear. "What is happening?" Victoria muttered under her breath, so quietly that only the woman standing closest to her caught it. This isn't what was supposed to..." By the second verse, an elderly man near the front of the crowd, silver hair, dressed in a tuxedo that looked like it had been tailored sometime in the previous century, rose unsteadily from his seat, his hand pressed flat against his chest, tears already streaking down his weathered face. "I saw her," he said, his voice trembling, loud enough now that heads turned toward him. "I saw her sing this exact song. 1980. God, it must have been 1996, Madison Square Garden. I was there with my wife. She's gone now, God rest her, but I was there." "What are you talking about, Harold?" The woman beside him hissed, gripping his arm. "It's her," Harold said louder now, pointing a trembling finger toward the small stage. "It's her. That's Lorraine Harris. My God, that's Lorraine Harris standing right there." The name moved through the crowd like an electric current, person to person, faster than anyone could control it. Lorraine Harris, Lorraine Harris. The whisper multiplied, doubled, tripled, until it wasn't a whisper anymore but a murmur rolling across 300 stunned faces, and Lorraine kept singing through all of it, her eyes closed now, lost somewhere between the woman she'd become and the woman she'd buried. Victoria's hand flew to her own throat. That can't be." She turned to her friend Pamela, eyes wide with something that had gone well past confusion into genuine panic. "Pamela, who is she? Do you know who this is?" Pamela was already pulling up something on her phone, thumb scrolling frantically. Her face went pale. She turned the screen toward Victoria without a word. Photograph of Lorraine Harris, decades younger, standing on a Madison Square Garden stage in an emerald green gown. 3 Grammy Awards lined up on a table beside her. The exact same gold microphone clutched in her hand. The exact same dress Lorraine was wearing right now. The exact same microphone Lorraine was holding right now. Victoria's entire face drained of color. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not possible. She's the cleaning lady. She cleans my house. She's not..." But the proof was standing 6 feet away, voice soaring through a ballroom that had gone completely, utterly silent, except for the sound she was making. A sound so pure and so devastating that grown men in tuxedos were openly weeping. Now a sound that seemed to be pulling something out of every single person in that room they hadn't even known they'd buried. Lorraine reached the final chorus, and she let her voice climb to its full terrifying height, the note hanging in the air like something tangible, something you could almost reach out and touch. And the entire ballroom seemed to lean forward as one body drawn toward her, the way iron filings are drawn toward a magnet. When the final note finally faded, when Lorraine lowered the microphone and opened her eyes, there was a silence so complete it felt like the room itself had stopped breathing. And then it broke. The applause started slowly, one person, then another, then the entire room rising to its feet in a wave that crashed through the ballroom like thunder. People who had been laughing at her 20 minutes earlier were now standing, hands pressed to their mouths, tears streaming freely down faces that had been carefully composed into polite condescension just moments before. Phones that had been raised to capture humiliation were now raised to capture something else entirely, a resurrection, happening in real time in front of 300 witnesses. "Lorraine Harris," someone near the front shouted, and the name spread through the crowd, again this time, not as a whisper, but as something closer to a chant. Victoria stood frozen in the middle of it all, her silver gown suddenly looking cheap and forgettable, next to the woman she'd spent the entire evening humiliating, her carefully constructed joke collapsing around her in real time, with 300 witnesses and at least a dozen phone cameras recording every second of her unraveling. Victoria started, then stopped, then tried again, her voice climbing towards something close to hysteria. "There's been some kind of misunderstanding. I had no idea. I would never have. Wouldn't you?" The voice came from behind her, calm and steady, and Victoria spun around to find Raymond Carter standing there dressed sharply, his expression carved from something hard and unforgiving. "Excuse me, do I know you?" Victoria demanded, though her voice had lost most of its earlier authority. "Raymond Carter," and he said, "I produced 3 of Lorraine's Grammy-winning albums. I've known this woman for 30 years, and I think it's time this room learned exactly why Lorraine Harris ended up cleaning houses for a living in the first place." A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd, mixed now with something sharper. Curiosity, suspicion, the particular hunger of 300 wealthy people who had just realized they were standing at the edge of a much bigger story than they'd expected. "Raymond, this isn't the time," Lorraine said quietly, lowering the microphone, but Raymond shook his head. "It's exactly the time, Lorraine. You've spent 20 years being quiet. I'm done watching you do that." He turned back to the crowd, raising his voice so it carried to every corner of the ballroom. "Does anyone here know who sits on the board of Sentinel Records? Does anyone here know who pushed through the liquidation of Lorraine Harris's masters 19 years ago, stripping her of royalties she should still be collecting to this day?" Silence. "Gregory Ellsworth," Raymond said, letting the name hang in the air like a verdict. "Victoria's husband, the man who built half his fortune off contracts he gutted from artists who didn't have the resources to fight back. Lorraine Harris was one of them." Gasps rippled through the crowd, a second time sharper, now more pointed. Several guests turned instinctively towards the entrance where Gregory Ellsworth himself had just arrived, fashionably late, always still in the process of removing his overcoat, completely unaware of the storm he was walking into. "What's going on in here?" Gregory called out, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life walked into a room and felt unwelcome. 300 faces turned toward him in unison. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. Gregory's smile faltered the moment he registered the silence, the stares the phones angled toward him instead of away. "Victoria," he said slowly, scanning the room. "What exactly did I miss?" Nobody answered him at first. The silence stretched, heavy and electric, until Raymond Carter stepped forward, positioning himself directly between Gregory and the small stage where Lorraine still stood. "You missed quite a bit, actually," Raymond said. "Why don't you come up here and say hello to an old friend, Gregory? I think you two have some history worth discussing in front of all these very important people you've spent your whole career trying to impress." Gregory's eyes finally landed on Lorraine, really landed on her. Taking in the emerald gown, the gold microphone, the face he hadn't seen in person in 19 years, but recognized instantly, the recognition crashing across his features like a wave hitting rock. "Lorraine," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the single syllable, all his earlier confidence draining out of him in real time. "Lorraine Harris." "Hello, Gregory," Lorraine said quietly, her voice carrying easily through the silent ballroom. "It's been a long time." The crowd shifted, sensing the temperature dropping even further, sensing that whatever was about to happen next was going to be far more devastating than anything Victoria had originally planned for the evening. Victoria looked between her husband and the woman she'd invited as a joke, her face cycling rapidly through confusion, dawning horror, and something that looked dangerously close to panic. "Gregory, you know her. You actually know her." Gregory didn't answer right away. He couldn't seem to find words at all, standing frozen near the entrance of his own gala while 300 guests watched the color drain entirely from his face. "Why don't you tell your wife how you know me, Gregory?" Lorraine said, her voice steady despite the storm building visibly behind her eyes. "Why don't you tell this entire room exactly what happened to my masters 19 years ago? Tell them about the contract clause you buried on page 47 that nobody bothered explaining to me until it was already too late to fight it. Tell them about the calls that stopped coming the month after I refused to sign away my publishing rights for a fraction of what they were worth." "Lorraine, that's not," Gregory started, his voice strangled. "Tell them," Lorraine repeated, and something in her tone made the entire room go even quieter if such a thing were possible. Gregory's jaw worked silently, his hands flexing at his sides like a man trying to find solid ground that kept shifting beneath him. The silence stretched so long that someone near the back of the crowd actually whispered, "Is he going to say anything?" "Gregory," Victoria said, her voice climbing towards something frantic, now tugging at his sleeve like a child trying to wake a parent from a nightmare. "Tell them this is ridiculous. Tell them this woman is confused. Tell them—" "Don't," Gregory said quietly, and the single word landed with enough weight that Victoria actually stepped back from him. "Don't what?" Victoria's voice cracked. "Gregory, what is happening right now?" He didn't look at his wife. His eyes stayed locked on Lorraine, and something in his expression had shifted from shock into something heavier. Something closer to shame, though shame was clearly an emotion he hadn't practiced wearing in a very long time, and it sat awkwardly on his face like a suit 2 sizes too small. "Lorraine Harris was the most talented artist I ever signed," Gregory said, finally his voice low but carrying in the dead silence of the ballroom. 3 platinum albums, a voice that could make grown men cry in a recording booth. I knew exactly what I had. "Then why," Raymond cut in sharply, stepping closer, "did you let her contract lapse the same month she refused to renegotiate her publishing rights?" Gregory's eyes flicked toward Raymond, something defensive flaring briefly before collapsing under the weight of 300 staring faces. It wasn't personal. "It was entirely personal," Lorraine said, and her voice, though quiet, cut through the ballroom like the opening note of her song had minutes earlier. "You sat across from me at a conference table in Midtown Manhattan, Gregory, and you told me that artists who didn't understand the business side of the industry tended to disappear quickly. You said it like a warning. I remember exactly how you said it because I went home that night and couldn't sleep, because I knew exactly what you meant by it." A woman near the front pressed a hand to her chest, gasping audibly. Several guests had their phones raised now, not to capture humiliation anymore, but something else entirely. Evidence history correcting itself in real time. "I didn't think it would go that far," Gregory said, his voice dropping, almost pleading. Now the polished executive veneer cracking wide open in front of an audience that had spent decades watching him project nothing but control. "I didn't personally order the radio stations to stop playing your records. I didn't personally—" "But you knew," Lorraine said. "You sat on the board. You knew exactly what was happening to my masters when they got bundled into that liquidation sale. You knew my royalties were being redirected through shell distributions that conveniently routed profits back to companies you had stakes in. I spent 3 years trying to get a lawyer to even look at the paperwork. Gregory and every single one of them told me the same thing, that fighting Sentinel Records meant fighting men like you. And men like you always won." "That's enough," Gregory said sharply, some of his old authority flickering back into his voice, a last reflexive grasp at control. "I don't have to stand here and be lectured at my own gala by the woman you destroyed," Raymond interrupted, his voice rising now sharp enough that several guests flinched. "By the woman whose voice built careers for half the executives in this room, who then watched her disappear into poverty while men like you collected the royalties she should have been living on." The crowd had gone utterly still, the kind of stillness that exists right before something breaks completely. Near the center of the room, an older woman in a deep blue gown stepped forward slightly, her voice trembling but clear. "I remember now. I remember the lawsuits that got quietly settled. My husband worked in entertainment law back then. He used to come home talking about a case Sentinel buried with non-disclosure agreements. He never told me the artist's name. He said he wasn't allowed to. The woman's words landed like another stone dropped into already churning water. Heads turned toward Gregory, the murmuring growing louder, less restrained, now the polite veneer of the Gala fully stripped away. "Is that true?" someone called out from the crowd. "Did you bury a lawsuit?" Gregory's mouth opened, but nothing came out. For the first time in what was likely decades, the man who had built an entire career on never being caught off guard found himself with absolutely no script to follow. Victoria, watching her husband unravel in front of the very people whose approval she'd spent her entire adult life chasing, seemed to finally understand the magnitude of what was happening. "Gregory, say something," she hissed. "Anything. They're all staring at us." "What do you want me to say, Victoria?" Gregory finally snapped, turning on her with a sharpness that made several nearby guests step back. "That it's true that I sat on that board and let it happen. Because the numbers made sense and nobody on that board ever stopped to think about what we were doing to actual people's lives. Is that what you want me to say in front of 300 people? The admission, half shouted, half strangled, landed in the ballroom like a bomb going off in slow motion. Phones that had been recording quietly now seemed to multiply, raised from every direction, capturing the exact moment Gregory Ellsworth confirmed out loud in his own voice in front of his own guests exactly what Lorraine had spent 19 years unable to prove in any courtroom. Lorraine stood very still through all of it, the gold microphone still loose in her hand, watching the man who had quietly dismantled her life finally collapse under the weight of his own words. She felt something she hadn't expected to feel in this exact moment. Not triumph exactly, not even satisfaction, but something quieter and more complicated. A kind of exhausted relief, the relief of finally being believed by people who had no reason to lie on her behalf. "There's more," Raymond said, stepping forward again, pulling a folded set of papers from inside his jacket with the calm precision of a man who had been planning this moment for weeks. "I spent the last several days going through old financial filings, public records, things that were always technically available if anyone had bothered to look. Gregory Ellsworth didn't just bury one case. There were at least 4 other artists at Sentinel Records who experienced nearly identical circumstances over a span of 12 years. 3 of them women. 2 of them black women specifically, all of whom mysteriously found their contracts dissolved, their masters liquidated, and their careers quietly ended right around the moment they pushed back on unfavorable terms." A wave of horrified murmurs swept through the crowd. "This isn't just about one bad deal." Raymond continued, raising the paper slightly so the nearest guest could see the printed documents. "This is a pattern, a deliberate, repeated pattern of targeting artists who didn't have the legal resources to fight back and disproportionately targeting artists of color because Gregory Ellsworth and the board he sat on understood exactly who was least likely to win a protracted legal battle against a company with infinite resources." "That's a serious accusation," someone in the crowd called out, though the voice carried more alarm than skepticism. "It's a documented one," Raymond said simply. "I'm happy to share every page with anyone in this room who wants to see it, or with any journalist who happens to be here tonight, since I noticed at least 2 of you when I walked in." A ripple of nervous energy moved through the crowd as several guests exchanged glances, and Lorraine caught sight of 2 people near the back of the room, a man and a woman both holding notepads they'd apparently been too polite to use until this exact moment, both now scribbling furiously. Victoria's face had gone past pale into something closer to gray. "Gregory," she whispered, her voice barely audible now. "Is this true, any of it?" Gregory didn't answer her. He was staring at Lorraine, and something in his expression had shifted again. The defensiveness draining out of him, replaced by something that looked almost like exhaustion. Like a man finally setting down a weight he'd been carrying so long, he'd forgotten how heavy it actually was. "I built this house on contracts like yours, Lorraine," he said quietly, so quietly that the room had to lean in to hear him. "I told myself for years it was just business, that the law allowed it, so it wasn't really wrong. I think I actually believed that for a long time." "And now?" Lorraine asked. Gregory was quiet for a long moment. "Now I'm standing in my own ballroom, watching my wife try to humiliate the one person whose career I helped destroy, and I'm realizing I never once in 19 years wondered what happened to you afterward. I never wondered if you were okay. I just moved on to the next deal." His voice cracked slightly. "That's the part I can't explain away, even to myself." The ballroom had gone almost unbearably quiet. 300 guests caught somewhere between horror and fascination, watching a man's entire carefully constructed reputation dissolve in real time. Watching a woman they'd mocked 20 minutes earlier stand taller and more dignified than anyone else in the room. Victoria looked around at the crowd, at the phone still raised at the journalist, scribbling notes at her husband's quiet, devastating confession hanging in the air, and something in her finally broke. "This was supposed to be funny," she said, her voice thin and brittle, almost childlike. "It was supposed to be a joke. I didn't know any of this. I swear I didn't know." "You didn't need to know the details to know it was cruel, Victoria," Lorraine said, turning to face her directly for the first time since the song had ended. "You looked at a woman who cleans your floors and decided her dignity was something you could use for entertainment. You didn't need a file full of legal documents to understand that was wrong. You just didn't care because you never imagined I was anything more than what you needed me to be." Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time since Lorraine had met her, Victoria Ellsworth had absolutely nothing to say. And somewhere near the back of the ballroom, completely unnoticed in the chaos, a phone buzzed in Pamela's hand, a news alert breaking already spreading across social media, a video clip of Lorraine's first note tagged and shared and reposted thousands of times in the few minutes since it had happened. A hashtag already forming, already climbing, already turning into something far bigger than anyone in that room could have predicted. Something that was about to follow the Ellsworth name long after the gala lights went dark. Pamela's phone wasn't the only one lighting up. Within minutes, 3 more guests were staring down at their screens, the same video clip circulating faster than anyone in that ballroom could track. Comment counts climbing in real time. Strangers thousands of miles away, already typing out reactions to a moment that had happened less than 10 minutes earlier. "Victoria people are already talking about this online." Pamela said, her voice low and urgent, angling her phone so Victoria could see the numbers climbing. "This isn't staying in this room. This is already everywhere." Victoria stared at the screen like it had physically struck her. "That's not possible. It's been 5 minutes. "It's the internet, Victoria," Pamela said grimly. 5 minutes is forever." Gregory had gone very still beside his wife, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular, the kind of stillness that comes right before a man realizes the floor beneath him has already given way, and he simply hasn't fallen yet. Around them, the ballroom had shifted into something closer to a low electric roar, 300 conversations happening at once, all of them circling the same impossible center. The woman in the emerald gown who was once again holding court, the way she must have held court decades earlier, except this time the spotlight had found her by accident instead of design. "Lorraine!" A new voice cut through the noise, and Lorraine turned to find a younger woman pushing her way through the crowd, maybe 30 years old, dressed in a simple black dress that stood out sharply against the sequins and silk surrounding her, a small recorder already in her hand. "I'm so sorry to interrupt. My name is Carla Reyes. I write for the Greenwich Courier, and I think what's happening here tonight is significant enough that people deserve to understand it properly. Not just through clips online. Would you be willing to speak with me, even just briefly?" Lorraine studied the young woman's face for a moment, genuine, a little nervous, clearly aware of the strangeness of asking for an interview in the middle of a ballroom that hadn't yet stopped buzzing. "What exactly do you want to know?" "Everything," Carla said honestly. "But mostly I want to know how this happened. How does someone go from 3 Grammy Awards to cleaning houses and nobody notices? How does an entire industry let that happen?" Lorraine felt the question settle into her chest heavier than she expected. She glanced toward Raymond, who gave her the smallest nod, the same nod he'd given her before she'd stepped onto that small platform less than half an hour ago. "It happens quietly," Lorraine said finally, her voice carrying further than she intended, several nearby guests going silent to listen. "That's the part people don't understand. There's no dramatic moment where someone tells you your career is over. There's just silence, calls that don't get returned, meetings that get rescheduled and then rescheduled again until they stop happening altogether. You spend years thinking it's a string of bad luck. And then one day you'll look up and you've been gone from the industry for so long that people stop remembering you were ever there in the first place." "And nobody helped you?" Carla asked, her recorder still running. "A few people tried," Lorraine said. "Lawyers who took my case for free for a while until the cost of fighting Sentinel Records became too much for a small practice to absorb. Friends who made calls on my behalf that never got returned. But mostly no. Mostly I learned that the industry protects itself far more efficiently than it protects the people who built it." Across the room, Gregory flinched visibly at the words. though nobody seemed to notice except Lorraine, who caught the small movement out of the corner of her eye and felt for just a moment something close to pity mixed in with everything else she was feeling toward him. Pity was complicated. She hadn't expected to feel it tonight of all nights. "What about your family?" Carla asked gently. "Did you have support?" "My daughter," Lorraine said, and her voice softened noticeably. "Michelle, she was 12 when all of this started. She grew up watching her mother go from arenas to apartment buildings, and she never once complained, not once, even when things got hard enough that I had to choose between groceries and her school supplies some months. She's the reason I kept going." As if summoned by her own words, the ballroom doors opened again, and Michelle Harris stepped through them, dressed simply but elegantly, her eyes immediately scanning the crowd until they found her mother standing in the center of it all. The crowd parted slightly as she moved through it, drawn by some instinct toward the resemblance. The same bone structure, the same steady eyes. "Mama!" Michelle said, her voice cracking slightly as she closed the distance between them, pulling Lorraine into an embrace that made several guests around them actually start crying again, the raw, unguarded emotion of it cutting straight through the remaining tension in the room. "You came," Lorraine whispered into her daughter's shoulder. "I told you I was driving down," Michelle said, pulling back just enough to look at her mother's face, tears streaking down both of their cheeks now. "I heard it from the parking lot, Mama. I heard you singing from the parking lot. I haven't heard you sing like that since I was a little girl." The moment held for several seconds. Mother and daughter standing in the middle of a ballroom full of strangers, completely unbothered by the cameras still capturing every second of it, and something about the rawness of that embrace seemed to finally crack something open in the crowd that the singing alone hadn't quite managed to do. This wasn't spectacle anymore. This was simply two people who loved each other, reunited in a moment neither of them had expected to happen tonight. And the authenticity of it silenced even the last few whispers of gossip still circulating through the room. "Mrs. Harris," came another voice, this one older, more measured, and Lorraine turned to find a tall man in his 70s approaching, flanked by two younger associates who looked distinctly uncomfortable to be standing this close to the unfolding chaos. "My name is Charles Whitfield. I'm the chairman of the Whitfield Foundation. I believe we've never formally met, though I knew your music very well in my younger years." "Mr. Whitfield," Lorraine said carefully, recognizing the name immediately, one of the most respected philanthropic figures in the entertainment industry, a man whose foundation had quietly funded scholarships and legal aid for artists for the better part of 3 decades. "I want to be direct with you, given the circumstances," Charles said, glancing briefly toward Gregory, who was still standing frozen near the edge of the crowd, looking smaller by the minute. "What you've just described, the pattern Mr. Carter outlined regarding Sentinel Records, that's not the first time I've heard whispers of something like this. We've had at least 3 other artists approach our foundation over the years with similar stories, all involving contracts that were dissolved under suspicious circumstances, all involving masters that quietly vanished into liquidation sales that conveniently benefited a small circle of executives." A murmur rippled through the nearby guests who'd overheard this exchange. Lorraine felt something tighten in her chest, not fear of Bonnie, but the particular vertigo of realizing a private wound might actually be part of something much larger than she'd ever allowed herself to imagine. "Are you saying this happened to other people too?" Lorraine asked quietly. "I'm saying I'd very much like to formally investigate it," Charles said. "With your permission and ideally your involvement, given that you're now the most visible case anyone in this room has personally witnessed unfold." Before Lorraine could respond, a commotion near the edge of the room drew everyone's attention. Gregory had stepped forward, his face pale, but his voice suddenly steadier than it had been minutes earlier, the practiced calm of a man trying desperately to regain control of a narrative that had already slipped entirely out of his hands. "I think," Gregory said, raising his voice just enough to carry, "that everyone here is getting a very one-sided version of events tonight. Business decisions made decades ago shouldn't be judged by the standards of—" "Stop," Victoria said suddenly, her voice cutting through her husband's sentence, with a sharpness none of the guests had heard from her all evening. Every head in the vicinity turned toward her in surprise, including Gregory's. "Victoria," Gregory started. "No," Victoria said, and there were tears in her eyes now. Real ones, the careful makeup beginning to streak slightly at the corners. "No, Gregory, I'm not doing this. I'm not standing here defending you while you tried to talk your way out of ruining this woman's entire life. I invited her here as a joke. I'm horrified by that now, genuinely horrified, but at least I can say I didn't know what I was doing. You knew exactly what you were doing for 19 years, and you let me think you were just a brilliant businessman the entire time. The room had gone utterly silent again. 300 guests now watching what had transformed in the span of 20 minutes from a planned humiliation into a complete public unraveling of an entire marriage and an entire fortune's foundation. Victoria, this is not the place. Gregory tried again, his voice low and urgent, now almost pleading. It's exactly the place, Victoria said, her voice rising. You built this house, this gala, this entire life. We live on the backs of people like her. And I never once asked questions because I liked the house too much to wonder where the money actually came from. That's on me. I have to live with that. But I am not standing here pretending I didn't just learn something that changes everything I thought I knew about my own husband. Gasps rippled through the surrounding guests, and somewhere near the back, a woman's voice called out, "Is she leaving him right here?" Victoria didn't answer the question directly, but the look on her face, devastated, humiliated, and somehow more honest than anything she'd said all evening, answered it clearly enough for anyone paying attention. Lorraine watched the unraveling with a strange, complicated stillness. She hadn't come here for this. She hadn't come here to destroy a marriage, or end a man's career, or become the center of a media storm that was clearly only just beginning. She'd come here, if she was honest with herself, simply to stop being invisible for one night. Everything happening now felt like it had taken on a momentum entirely separate from her own intentions, a storm she'd accidentally summoned just by daring to sing. "Lorraine," Raymond said quietly, stepping close enough that only she could hear him clearly over the continuing chaos. "Are you all right?" "I don't know," Lorraine admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to be heard, Raymond. I didn't necessarily want all of this." "Sometimes you don't get to choose the size of the truth once it starts coming out," Raymond said gently. "You just get to choose how you carry yourself through it. And so far, you've carried yourself like the woman I remember from 20 years ago. Don't lose that now." Lorraine nodded slowly, drawing in a long breath, steadying herself the way she used to steady herself in the wings before walking out onto a stage that held 20,000 strangers. Michelle's hand found hers and squeezed gently, grounding her further. Charles Whitfield, still standing nearby, cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. Harris, I don't want to add pressure to an already overwhelming evening, but I want you to know, whenever you're ready, my foundation's resources are available to you. Legal support, public advocacy, whatever you need to finally pursue what should have been pursued 19 years ago. You shouldn't have to fight this alone the way you clearly did the first time. Thank you," Lorraine said quietly, the offer landing somewhere deep and unexpected inside her chest. The first real institutional support she'd been offered in 2 decades. Near the small platform, Carla the journalist was still scribbling furiously in her notepad, occasionally glancing up to capture some new detail of the unfolding scene. Victoria, now standing apart from Gregory, entirely arms crossed tightly over her chest, refusing to look at him. Gregory himself surrounded now by a small cluster of guests who had clearly been business associates, all of them asking quiet, urgent questions he seemed entirely unprepared to answer. The older gentleman, Harold, still dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief, telling anyone who would listen about the night in 1996 when he and his late wife had watched Lorraine Harris bring down the house at Madison Square Garden. "This is going to be the story of the year," Carla murmured to herself almost involuntarily, and the woman standing beside her, another journalist, this one from a larger outlet who had clearly recognized the scale of what was unfolding and abandoned all pretense of subtlety, nodded grimly in agreement. 20 minutes had passed since Lorraine first lifted that gold microphone, and in that span of time, an entire evening that had been engineered for one woman's cruel entertainment had transformed into something closer to a public reckoning, with no clear sign yet of where it would finally land. "Mrs. Ellsworth," one of the catering staff said nervously, approaching Victoria with visible reluctance. "Should we still serve dinner? The kitchen is asking." "I don't know," Victoria said, her voice hollow now, all the earlier brightness completely drained out of it. "I genuinely don't know what we're supposed to do right now." It was Lorraine, surprisingly, who spoke next, her voice carrying across the room with a calm authority that immediately drew every eye back toward her. "Serve the dinner," she said simply. "There are 300 people here who came for an evening, and most of them didn't do anything wrong tonight except watch. They shouldn't go home hungry because of what their host decided to do with a microphone." A ripple of something close to relief moved through the crowd. The practical normalcy of the suggestion, offering a brief reprieve from the emotional intensity that had gripped the room for the past 20 minutes. The catering staff moved quickly to begin setting up the first course, grateful for direction, and slowly, hesitantly, the crowd began to disperse toward their assigned tables. Though the conversation buzzing among them showed no signs of returning to anything resembling polite gala small talk. As guests began moving toward their seats, Gregory approached Lorraine alone, his associates having peeled away to give him space, his posture noticeably smaller than it had been when he first walked through the door less than an hour earlier. "Lorraine," he said quietly, "whatever happens after tonight with the press, with potential legal action, with whatever Charles decides to investigate, I want you to know I'm not going to fight it. I'm not going to hide behind lawyers this time. I think some part of me has been waiting 19 years for someone to finally make me face this." Lorraine studied his face for a long moment, searching for the calculation she'd grown so used to seeing in powerful men, the careful repositioning that usually followed an admission like this. She didn't find it. What she found instead looked uncomfortably like genuine exhaustion, the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for far longer than he'd ever admitted even to himself. "I appreciate you saying that," Lorraine said finally, "but I think you understand that an apology, even a sincere one, doesn't undo 19 years. "I know," Gregory said quietly. "I'm not asking it to." He turned and walked away toward his wife, who watched him approach with an expression Lorraine couldn't quite read. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first uncertain step toward a conversation neither of them had ever expected to be having in front of 300 witnesses. Michelle squeezed her mother's hand again. "How are you feeling, Mama, really?" Lorraine looked around the ballroom at the guests slowly settling into their seats, still buzzing with hushed conversation. At Victoria and Gregory, standing several feet apart, clearly about to have the most difficult conversation of their marriage. At Raymond, watching her with quiet pride. At Charles Whitfield, already on his phone, presumably beginning to set wheels in motion that would take this story far beyond the walls of this ballroom. "Tired," Lorraine admitted. "Tired in a way that feels different from the tired I've been carrying for 20 years. This feels like the kind of tired that comes after finally putting something heavy down." "Good tired, then," Michelle said softly. "Good tired," Lorraine agreed. But even as she said it, even as the dinner service began, and the string quartet tentatively resumed playing something soft and uncertain in the background, Lorraine couldn't shake the feeling that the night was far from over. Charles Whitfield was still on his phone. The journalists were still taking notes. And somewhere out in the parking lot, more cars were arriving, black sedans, the kind that usually carried lawyers or executives, or people whose presence at a gala like this one was never an accident. Whatever had been set into motion tonight, Lorraine understood with growing certainty had only just begun. Charles Whitfield slipped his phone back into his jacket pocket and turned to one of his associates, murmuring something too low for Lorraine to catch before approaching her again with the measured calm of a man who had spent decades navigating exactly this kind of high-stakes social terrain. "I just spoke with my legal team," he said. "They're already pulling the original Sentinel Records liquidation filings from the public archive. If even half of what Mr. Carter outlined holds up, we're looking at a pattern serious enough to warrant a formal investigation, possibly even congressional attention, given the scale of the financial irregularities involved." "Congressional attention," Lorraine repeated slowly, the words feeling strange and oversized in her mouth. "These things move fast once the right people start paying attention," Charles said. "And believe me, Mrs. Harris, the right people are now paying attention." Near the bar, two more guests had drifted closer, listening without bothering to disguise their interest anymore. One of them, a heavy-set man in his 50s with silver cufflinks that caught the chandelier light every time he gestured, stepped forward with visible hesitation. "Forgive me for intruding," he said, "but I think I might have something relevant. My name is Walter Briggs. I used to work in accounting for a firm that handled some of Sentinel's outside audits years ago. I was let go rather suddenly after I flagged some irregularities in the distribution reports discrepancies that never got a satisfactory explanation. I always assumed it was just bureaucratic incompetence. I never connected it to anything like this." The ballroom, which had been slowly settling into the rhythm of dinner service, seemed to ripple again with renewed tension. Gregory, seated now at the head table beside an empty chair where Victoria had not yet returned, visibly stiffened at the mention of the name Sentinel, his fork frozen halfway to his plate. "Mr. Briggs," Raymond said, stepping closer with the quiet urgency of a man who recognized the value of what was being offered. Would you be willing to provide a statement? Formally, I mean, to Mr. Whitfield's team or to the journalists here tonight. Walter glanced nervously toward Gregory's table, then back toward Lorraine, something shifting visibly in his posture, the particular courage of an ordinary man who had spent years quietly regretting his own silence and was suddenly being offered a chance to undo it. Yes, he said finally. Yes, I think I would. Lorraine felt something tighten in her chest, not unlike the feeling she used to get right before stepping onto a stage, anticipation tangled with something close to dread. Every minute this story seemed to grow larger than the one she'd walked into the ballroom carrying. She'd come here for one song, one moment of being seen. She hadn't anticipated unearthing an entire excavation site. Lorraine, Michelle's voice was soft beside her, grounding. You don't have to carry all of this tonight. You already did the hardest part. Did I, though? Lorraine murmured, watching as Charles Whitfield's associate pulled out a small recorder to take Walter's statement, watching as Carla the journalist hovered nearby, with her notepad watching as more guests drifted closer, drawn by the gravitational pull of a story actively rewriting itself in real time. It feels like the hardest part might only be starting. Across the room, Victoria reappeared, having clearly stepped away to compose herself. Her makeup repaired, but her eyes still red-rimmed, her posture noticeably different now. Smaller, more careful, the practiced confidence of the evening's earlier hours completely gone. She approached Lorraine slowly, stopping a respectful distance away, as though uncertain whether she'd earned the right to come any closer. Lorraine, she said quietly, I know an apology means very little right now. Probably nothing at all given everything that's come out tonight. But I am sorry, genuinely. I looked at you for 2 years and I never once wondered who you actually were. That's the part that scares me most looking back. Not just what I did tonight, but how easy it was for me to overlook you for 2 entire years before that. Lorraine studied her for a long moment, weighing the sincerity against the spectacle, trying to separate the woman speaking now from the woman who had handed her a microphone 20 minutes ago like bait in a trap. I appreciate you saying it, Lorraine said carefully. But Victoria, the most important thing you can do with that realization isn't apologize to me. It's ask yourself how many other people you walk past every single day without truly seeing. I won't be the only one. Victoria absorbed that in silence, her jaw tightening, something flickering behind her eyes that looked almost like the beginning of genuine self-reflection, rare and uncomfortable on a face that had spent so many years avoiding exactly that kind of scrutiny. I'd like to help, Victoria said finally. However that's even possible at this point. I have resources, connections. I know that probably sounds hollow coming from me tonight of all nights, but I mean it. We'll see, Lorraine said, not unkindly, but with the careful neutrality of a woman who had been burned too many times by careless promises to accept one easily, even one that sounded sincere. Dinner continued around them in fits and starts, conversations buzzing low and urgent at every table, the string quartet doing their best to fill the silences with something resembling normalcy. But normalcy had left this ballroom the moment Lorraine lifted that gold microphone, and nobody in the room, including Lorraine herself, seemed entirely certain what was supposed to happen next. Near the entrance, a new commotion stirred. 2 more black sedans had pulled up outside, and through the tall windows, guests could see figures emerging, moving with the brisk, purposeful walk of people who had somewhere important to be and very little patience for valets. Charles Whitfield glanced toward the door, then back at Lorraine, a faint, knowing expression crossing his face. That'll be the legal team I called, he said. And unless I'm mistaken, possibly someone from the district attorney's office as well, given the financial fraud implications Mr. Carter raised earlier. Things are about to move very quickly, Mrs. Harris. Lorraine felt Michelle's hand tighten around hers, felt Raymond step slightly closer on her other side, the 2 people who had refused to let her walk into this ballroom alone now flanking her again, as the doors opened and a new wave of consequence began making its way directly toward the center of the room, directly toward the man sitting frozen at the head table, his fork still untouched on his plate, his face the color of old ash beneath the warm gold light of chandeliers that, 20 minutes ago, had only ever shone down on his triumphs. The doors swung open and 3 figures strode in, a woman in a dark gray suit moving like she billed by the minute, flanked by 2 men carrying leather folios, and behind them unmistakably a 4th figure whose presence made several guests audibly gasp. District Attorney Patricia Moreno, recognizable from a dozen local news broadcasts over the years, her expression unreadable. Her eyes scanning the room with the practiced efficiency of someone assessing a crime scene rather than a charity gala. "Good evening," the woman in gray said, stopping a few feet from the head table, her voice cutting cleanly through the buzz of 300 conversations. "My name is Renata Cole. I'm with Whitfield Foundation Legal Services. I apologize for the interruption, but given the nature of what's apparently already circulating online, we felt it was important to move quickly." Gregory rose halfway out of his chair, his composure cracking visibly for the first time since his earlier confession. "I don't understand. Charles, what exactly did you call here?" "I called the people who needed to be here, Gregory," Charles Whitfield said calmly, stepping forward to stand beside Renata. "Given what's been said tonight in front of 300 witnesses and at least 2 journalists, I'd be doing the public a disservice if I waited until Monday morning to act on it." District Attorney Moreno stepped closer, her gaze settling on Gregory with the flat assessing patience of someone who had clearly done this exact walk toward exactly this kind of man many times before. "Mr. Ellsworth, I want to be very clear before anything else happens tonight. Nothing about your presence in this room obligates you to speak with us right now. But given the statements already made publicly this evening, your own admission, the documentation Mr. Carter has provided, and now Mr. Briggs's account, my office will be opening a formal inquiry into Sentinel Records liquidation practices beginning Monday." A ripple of stunned silence moved through the nearby tables, guests setting down forks, mid-bite conversations dying instantly. Victoria's hand found the back of her chair, gripping it like she needed the support to remain standing. "This is happening at my gala," she said weakly, to no one in particular, the absurdity of the sentence seeming to dawn on her even as she said it. "I'm afraid these things rarely wait for convenient timing," Moreno said, not unkindly, though there was no softness in it either. Gregory's associates, the small cluster of executives who'd gathered around him earlier, offering quiet support, had begun quietly drifting away, putting distance between themselves and the man at the center of the unfolding storm, with a practiced, self-preservation instinct of people who understood exactly how quickly proximity could become liability. Walter Moreno said, turning toward the accountant who'd come forward earlier, still standing near the bar, looking somewhat shell-shocked by how quickly his small act of courage had escalated. "I understand you have documentation relevant to discrepancies in Sentinel's distribution reports from your time there." "I do," Walter said, his voice steadier now than it had been minutes earlier. "I kept copies. I always wondered if I'd ever need them. I suppose I'm about to find out." "We'd like to schedule a formal interview as soon as possible," Moreno said. "Tonight, if you're willing." Walter glanced toward Lorraine, something passing between them that looked almost like solidarity, 2 strangers bound together now by an institution that had quietly wronged them both in different ways. "I'm willing," he said. Lorraine watched all of it unfold with a strange, dissociated calm, the kind of stillness that settles over a person when events have outpaced their ability to process them in real time. Michelle's hand remained tightly wound around hers, and Raymond stood close on her other side, his presence a steady anchor in a room that had transformed almost violently from spectacle to investigation in the span of a single hour. "Mrs. Harris," Moreno said, turning toward the Lorraine, now her tone shifting into something gentler, more deliberate. "I want to be respectful of what you've already been through tonight, but I also want you to understand that your testimony, formal testimony, would carry significant weight in establishing the timeline and pattern we're looking at. Would you be willing to speak with our office when you're ready? There's no urgency tonight specifically. I don't want to add to what's already been an overwhelming evening." Lorraine drew in a slow breath, feeling Michelle's grip tighten in silent support. "I've spent 19 years being told my story wasn't worth pursuing legally," she said quietly. "I think I'm more than ready to find out if that was actually true, or if it was just easier for everyone to tell me that." "It was a lie," Raymond said firmly. "It was always a lie, Lorraine. You just didn't have the resources to prove it before." Moreno gave a small, measured nod. "We'll be in touch this week then. Take whatever time you need before that." As the legal team began moving through the room, quietly gathering contact information from witnesses, several guests who had overheard fragments of conversation throughout the evening came forward unprompted, offering their own small pieces of the larger picture. A former radio executive who confirmed that Lorraine's records had indeed been pulled from rotation following an internal memo he'd never fully understood at the time. A retired entertainment lawyer who recalled vaguely but distinctly hearing whispers about Sentinel's liquidation practices being investigated internally years ago before the inquiry mysteriously stalled. Each new voice added another thread to a tapestry that had been invisible just an hour earlier, and Lorraine found herself standing at the center of it, watching strangers volunteer pieces of a puzzle she'd spent 2 decades believing she was the only one holding. Lorraine. Gregory's voice, quiet and strained, cut through the surrounding activity. He'd risen fully from his seat now, standing alone at the head table while his wife remained several feet away, unable or unwilling to come stand beside him. I think I owe you something more than what I've already said tonight. The room around them seemed to quiet again. Sensing another shift coming, the particular hush of an audience that understood it was witnessing something it would be talking about for years. I'm listening, Lorraine said. Gregory's hands trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket and withdrew a small leather notebook worn at the edges, clearly carried for a long time. I kept this, he said. I don't fully know why. Some kind of guilt I never let myself examine too closely, I suppose. It has names, dates, every artist whose contract I personally signed off on dissolving during my time on that board. I told myself for years I kept it in case I ever needed to defend my decisions. I think if I'm honest, I kept it because some part of me always knew I'd eventually need to answer for them instead. He held the notebook out, not toward Lorraine, but toward Moreno, his hands steady now despite the visible effort it cost him. There are 17 names in here, Gregory said, his voice cracking slightly on the number. Lorraine's isn't even the worst case. There's a man, an R&B artist from the late 80s who died in poverty 3 years after his masters were liquidated. I always told myself that wasn't connected to anything we did. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. The ballroom had gone completely silent now. 300 guests frozen mid-motion forks, suspended conversations abandoned entirely, watching a man methodically dismantle his own carefully built legacy in real time, watching 19 years of buried guilt come pouring out in a single overwhelming confession. Victoria finally moved, crossing the distance toward her husband, not to comfort him exactly, but to stand beside him, her expression a complicated mixture of horror and something that looked almost like the beginning of forgiveness, or at least the beginning of understanding that forgiveness might eventually be possible, even if it wasn't tonight. Why now? Victoria asked quietly, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Why give it to them now in front of everyone instead of just quietly handling it with lawyers like you always do? Gregory looked at her, then at Lorraine, then around the ballroom at the faces watching him. Some sympathetic, most simply stunned, a few, unmistakably hostile. Because quiet is exactly how I got away with it for 19 years, he said. I think the only way to actually fix something this broken is to stop being quiet about it. I should have figured that out a long time ago. I'm sorry it took watching her sing in my own ballroom to finally understand it. Moreno accepted the notebook, carefully sliding it into an evidence bag. One of her associates produced almost instantly the practiced efficiency of someone who had clearly anticipated exactly this kind of moment might happen tonight, even if she hadn't expected it quite this dramatically. Mr. Ellsworth, Moreno said, I want to be clear that this cooperation will be noted, and it may factor favorably into how this proceeds. But I also need to inform you that given what's in this notebook combined with tonight's statements, you should expect to be contacted formally, likely within the next several days, regarding both civil and potentially criminal liability. I understand, Gregory said quietly. I think I've understood that since the moment she opened her mouth and started singing. Across the room, Harold, the elderly man who'd first recognized Lorraine, had made his way closer, leaning heavily on a cane Lorraine hadn't noticed earlier, his eyes still wet, but his expression now carrying something fierce and protective. Young man, he said to Gregory, his voice trembling with age but unmistakably sharp. Do you have any idea what you took from the world when you buried her career? Do you understand that there are people my age who remember her music as the soundtrack to the best years of their lives, and you decided that didn't matter because of a contract clause? I understand that now, Gregory said quietly, unable to meet the older man's eyes. You should have understood it 19 years ago, Harold said before turning and making his way slowly back toward his seat, several nearby guests reaching out gently to steady him as he went. Lorraine watched the exchange with something tightening in her throat, an unexpected wave of emotion rising up that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the sheer overwhelming weight of being witnessed, truly witnessed by strangers who had no obligation to care about what happened to her and yet clearly did. Mama, Michelle whispered, are you doing okay? This is a lot even for you. I don't know what okay means right now, Lorraine admitted softly, but I don't feel invisible. I haven't felt invisible in almost an hour now. I'd forgotten what that actually feels like. Carla, the journalist, approached again more carefully this time, sensing the gravity of the moment. Mrs. Harris, I know this is overwhelming, but I have to ask, given everything that's come out tonight, what do you want to happen next? Not legally, personally. What does justice actually look like to you after 19 years of this? Lorraine considered the question for a long moment, the entire ballroom seeming to wait for her answer. Even those too far away to actually hear it leaning in slightly, sensing that something important was about to be said. I don't think justice is really about punishing Gregory, though I understand why the law needs to do what it needs to do, Lorraine said finally. I think justice looks like the next artist who refuses to sign away their rights, not having to disappear the way I did. I think it looks like industries actually changing, instead of just one man getting publicly humiliated and everyone going back to business as usual next week. That's a bigger ask than most people make in moments like this, Carla said. I'm 61 years old, Lorraine said, a small, tired smile finally breaking through. I think I've earned the right to ask for something bigger than just an apology. Near the head table, Victoria had quietly pulled Gregory aside, their voices too low now for anyone to make out clearly, though their body language told its own story. Victoria's arms crossed defensively, Gregory's shoulders slumped in something that looked like genuine unguarded grief. The two of them negotiating in real time, what remained of a marriage that had just been publicly gutted in front of 300 people and an unknown number of internet strangers. Charles Whitfield approached Lorraine one final time before the legal team began preparing to leave, his expression warm, despite the gravity of everything that had just unfolded. Mrs. Harris, I know tonight has been extraordinary in ways none of us anticipated walking in here, but I want you to know, whatever comes next, the investigation, the press attention, all of it, my foundation is fully behind you, not as charity, as an investment in correcting something that should have been corrected a very long time ago. Thank you, Lorraine said, and for the first time all evening, her voice carried something close to genuine hope instead of just exhaustion or resolve. As the legal team finally began making their way toward the exit papers, signed statements collected, contact information exchanged, the ballroom slowly began settling into something resembling its original rhythm, though nothing about the room felt the same as it had 2 hours earlier. The string quartet resumed playing softer now, almost reverent. Dinner service continued in fits and starts. Guests drifted between tables in hushed, urgent conversation. The night's events already being reshaped into the kind of story that would be retold at dinner parties for years to come. But Lorraine remained near the small platform where it had all begun, the gold microphone now resting quietly in its glass case once more, and she found herself staring at it with an expression that mixed exhaustion, disbelief, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. What happens now? Michelle asked softly, standing close beside her mother. Lorraine looked around the ballroom one final time at Victoria and Gregory, still locked in their quiet, devastating conversation. At Walter Briggs being escorted toward a private room by Moreno's associates. At Charles Whitfield, already deep in conversation with his legal team about next steps. At the dozens of strangers who had, in the span of 2 hours, transformed from an audience laughing at her humiliation into witnesses to something far more significant than any of them had walked in expecting to see. I think, Lorraine said slowly, that whatever happens now is bigger than just me. I think I just have to find a way to keep walking forward and trust that this time I won't be walking alone. Outside, beyond the tall windows of the Belmont estate, the first hints of dawn were still hours away, but somewhere out in the wider world, the video clip of Lorraine's first note had already crossed 500,000 views, climbing faster with every passing minute, carrying her name back into a world that had spent 19 years quietly pretending it had forgotten her. And the truth was, by morning, very few people anywhere would still be able to claim that. Part 5, Louis viết đủ 4.000 đến 4.500 từ, liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách truyền Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động, cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần 5 đạt điểm 10 trên 10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh, sửa lời ai, kể theo ngôi thứ 3 giữ độ kịch tính, không viết lan man. Kết thúc dùng câu khẳng định mạnh để khép lại câu chuyện rõ ràng, trọn vẹn. Lưu ý trả lời trong một tin nhắn không nhảy sang mức document mới. 2 đến 3 phút cần có mini climax và đắt 10 đến 15 mini climax, mỗi phần cứ 10 đến 12 phút có một twist lớn sâu sắc, đan xen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn, tăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật, thêm nhịp điệu. Kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi, mỗi 8 đến 10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh, viết văn bản phù hợp với tiết và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh nhé. Show more. 3 weeks later. Lorraine sat in a glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of a Manhattan office tower, a room that couldn't have looked more different from the laundry room where this entire chapter of her life had reignited. Across the table sat a panel of attorneys from Whitfield Foundation Legal Services, alongside Denise, who had insisted on being present for every single meeting since that night at the Belmont estate. The settlement offer came in this morning, Renata Cole said, sliding a folder across the table. Sentinel's parent company wants this resolved quickly before the DA's investigation goes any further. They're offering full restitution on the original masters, back royalties calculated with interest, in a public statement acknowledging the liquidation practices were, in their words, inconsistent with fair industry standards. Denise scanned the numbers, her eyebrows lifting slightly. Lorraine, this is substantial. This is more than substantial. Lorraine stared at the folder without opening it, her hands resting flat on the table. What happens to Gregory? That's separate from this settlement, Renata said carefully. The criminal inquiry is still ongoing. Mr. Briggs's documentation, combined with the notebook Gregory voluntarily provided, has already led to 2 additional artists coming forward with similar claims. It's looking less like an isolated incident and more like exactly the systemic pattern Mr. Carter described that night. And Victoria filed for divorce 2 weeks ago, Denise said quietly. Word is she's cooperating fully with investigators. Apparently, she's been going through old financial records herself, looking for anything that might help other artists who got caught in the same machine. Lorraine absorbed this in silence, thinking about the woman who had once called her the help, without bothering to learn her name, now apparently spending her nights combing through ledgers trying to undo some small fraction of the damage her husband's empire had caused. People could change, Lorraine supposed. Whether that change meant anything without consequence attached to it was a different question entirely, one she wasn't sure she had the energy to answer that afternoon. I want the money to go somewhere specific, Lorraine said finally, at opening the folder and scanning the numbers herself. Not all of it. I want enough set aside for Michelle and enough to finally stop worrying about rent. But the rest of it, I want it to go toward something that actually changes things for the next person standing where I was standing. Renata exchanged a glance with her colleagues. What did you have in mind? Lorraine had been thinking about this for 3 weeks, ever since the night had ended, and the adrenaline had finally drained out of her system, leaving behind something quieter and more deliberate. A legal defense fund, she said, specifically for artists, especially artists of color who get caught in exactly the kind of contract language that buried me. Free representation. Real representation, not the kind that gives up after a year because the other side has deeper pockets. That's an extraordinary undertaking, Renata said. Charles Whitfield already offered to help structure it, Lorraine said. He called me last week, said his foundation would match whatever I put in dollar for dollar if I was serious about it. Are you serious about it? Denise asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. I spent 19 years being the person nobody helped, Lorraine said. I think I'm done being that person quietly. I'd rather spend whatever years I have left making sure fewer people end up where I did. The meeting continued for another hour, details and clauses and timelines. The careful machinery of institutional change grinding slowly into motion. By the time Lorraine left the building, the late afternoon sun was slanting gold across the Manhattan skyline, and she found herself standing on the sidewalk for a long moment, simply breathing, letting the city move around her the way it used to when she was young and hungry, and certain the world owed her nothing but was going to give her everything anyway. Her phone buzzed. A text from Raymond, press conference confirmed for Friday. You ready? She typed back a single word, yes. Friday arrived faster than she expected, and Lorraine found herself standing backstage at a modest auditorium in downtown Stamford, the kind of venue that held maybe 400 people. Nothing like the arenas of her past, but somehow it felt exactly right for what she was about to do. Michelle stood beside her, smoothing the lapel of Lorraine's blazer with nervous, repetitive motions. "You're going to be incredible," Michelle said. "I'm terrified," Lorraine admitted. "You sang in front of 300 strangers who were laughing at you 20 minutes earlier," Michelle said, raising an eyebrow. "This is a room full of people who actually want to hear what you have to say." Lorraine managed a small laugh, the tension in her shoulders loosening just slightly. From beyond the curtain, she could hear the low murmur of the gathered crowd, journalists, advocates, several other artists who'd reached out in the weeks since the Gala video had crossed 10 million views, all of them wanting to be part of whatever was happening next. Raymond appeared at her side, adjusting his own jacket. "Charles is already out there, Walter Briggs too, and two of the other artists who came forward. This isn't just your story anymore, Lorraine. It's bigger than any of us expected it to become." "I know," Lorraine said. "That's what terrifies me most. I don't want to let any of them down." "You won't," Raymond said simply. "You never did." The curtain rose and Lorraine walked out into the bright lights of the small auditorium. The applause rising immediately warm and sustained. Nothing like the mocking laughter she'd faced weeks earlier, but somehow connected to it anyway. The same story finally completing its arc. She stepped up to the podium, found Michelle's face in the front row, found Raymond standing just off to the side, found Charles Whitfield seated near the front with an expression of quiet pride, and she began to speak. 19 years ago, I was told my career was over." Lorraine said, her voice steady despite the nerves still fluttering somewhere beneath her ribs. "I believed it because the silence that followed was so complete, so total, that there was no other explanation I could find for it. I spent those years thinking the silence meant I didn't matter anymore. I've since learned that the silence wasn't about whether I mattered. It was about whether the people with power found it convenient to admit that I did." A ripple of applause moved through the crowd, and Lorraine continued describing the Harris Foundation for Artist Justice, the legal defense fund, now fully structured and ready to receive its first cases, already fielding calls from artists across the country whose contracts bore the same suspicious fingerprints she'd recognized in her own. "This isn't about revenge," Lorraine said toward the end of her remarks. "I want to be very clear about that because I know it would be easy to frame this story as one woman getting even with the people who wronged her. That's not what this is. This is about making sure the next person doesn't have to clean houses for 2 years before someone finally bothers to ask who they actually are." The applause that followed was the kind that builds rather than fades, rising into something sustained. Several people in the audience rising to their feet, and Lorraine stood at that podium, feeling something she hadn't felt in 19 years. Not just being seen, but being useful. Her pain finally transformed into something that might actually protect someone else from experiencing the same thing. After the press conference, as the crowd slowly dispersed and reporters clustered around Charles Whitfield, for additional comments, a young woman approached Lorraine hesitantly, maybe 25 years old, holding a worn folder against her chest like armor. "Mrs. Harris," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Aisha Carter. I'm a singer, or I was trying to be before my contract got terminated last year under circumstances I never fully understood. I saw your video. I drove 4 hours to be here today." Lorraine felt something tighten in her chest, recognizing immediately the particular fear in the young woman's eyes. The fear of someone who'd been quietly erased and was only now daring to believe that erasure might not be permanent. "Tell me everything," Lorraine said, gently guiding her toward a quiet corner of the auditorium. "Start from the beginning." As Aisha began to speak, her words tumbling out faster as she realized she was finally being truly listened to, Lorraine recognized the shape of her own story reflected back at her, the same patterns, the same quiet erasure dressed up in legal language nobody had bothered to explain clearly. By the time Aisha finished, tears streaking down both their faces, Lorraine had already pulled out her phone and was dialing Renata Cole. "We have our first case," Lorraine said when the call connected. "Her name is Aisha Carter. I want her handled personally." 6 months later, Lorraine stood backstage once more, but this time the venue was considerably larger. A mid-sized theater in New York, hosting the inaugural benefit concert for the Harris Foundation, featuring performances from a dozen artists, several of whom had been directly helped by the fund's legal team in the months since its founding. Aisha Carter, her contract dispute resolved, and her masters returned, was scheduled to open the show. "Nervous?" Michelle asked, appearing at her mother's side, now working full-time as the Foundation's communications director, a role she'd taken to with a fierce, protective competence that made Lorraine's chest ache with pride every time she watched her daughter in action. A little, Lorraine admitted. It's different performing for a reason like this instead of just for myself. It's not different, Michelle said. It's the same thing it's always been. You singing your truth in front of people who need to hear it. Lorraine smiled, smoothing the fabric of a new gown. Not emerald this time, but a deep midnight blue, a color she'd chosen specifically because she didn't want tonight to be a repeat of the past. Tonight was about the future, about every artist who would walk through doors the foundation had pried back open. Backstage, she ran into Gregory unexpectedly. Of all people standing quietly near the stage door, dressed simply none of the polished executive armor he used to wear like a second skin. The criminal investigation had concluded 2 months earlier, a plea agreement, significant fines, a permanent ban from any executive role in the recording industry, restitution payments structured over the next decade to every artist whose masters had been improperly seized during his tenure. He'd avoided prison, but he'd lost nearly everything else that had once defined him. I wasn't sure I'd be welcome here, Gregory said quietly. You're not the headline tonight, Gregory, Lorraine said. But I didn't ask the foundation to bar you from buying a ticket either. I think watching what your silence cost people might do you some good. It already has, Gregory said. Think about it every single day now. I don't know if that means anything to you. It doesn't undo anything, Lorraine said honestly. But it's more than I expected from you 19 years ago. I'll take it. He nodded, something like genuine gratitude flickering across his face, and slipped quietly into the audience, taking a seat near the back, anonymous, now among hundreds of strangers, exactly where a man who'd once controlled an empire from boardrooms now belonged. The show began precisely on time, Aisha Carter's voice filling the theater with a clarity and confidence that made Lorraine's ears sting with unexpected tears, watching a young woman who'd nearly given up entirely now, standing tall under bright lights. Her masters restored her future, no longer dependent on the mercy of men who'd never bothered to learn her name. As the evening progressed, artist after artist took the stage, each one connected somehow to the foundation's growing reach. 17 active cases, now 4 already resolved, a legal precedent being slowly built that legal scholars were already citing in unrelated cases involving contract exploitation across entirely different industries. What had started as one woman's quiet humiliation at a cruel gala had become, in the span of 6 months, a movement with actual teeth, actual power, actual capacity to change something structural. Near the end of the night, Raymond stepped onto the stage to introduce the final performer, and Lorraine felt her heart rate climb as she realized he meant her. Tonight wouldn't exist without one woman's voice, Raymond told the crowd. A voice the industry tried very hard to make sure the world forgot. I think it's only fitting that she close out this evening herself. Lorraine walked onto that stage to thunderous applause. The gold microphone, donated permanently to the foundation by Gregory himself as part of his restitution agreement, now displayed in the lobby as a symbol rather than a trophy, waiting for her exactly where it belonged. She lifted it, closed her eyes, and let herself simply feel the weight of the room. 400 strangers who had come specifically to hear her sing. Not to mock her, not to use her as entertainment for someone else's cruelty, but because her voice had become something larger than herself, something that now belonged in some essential way to everyone who had ever been quietly erased and was still waiting for someone to finally say their name out loud again. The first note left her mouth soft and certain, and the theater fell into the same reverent silence that had once gripped a Greenwich ballroom, except this time the silence wasn't built on cruelty, waiting to unfold. This time it was built on something closer to reverence. 400 people leaning forward together, drawn toward a voice that had survived everything anyone had tried to do to silence it. Lorraine Harris sang that night not as a victim, reclaiming what was stolen, and not as a woman seeking revenge against the people who'd wronged her, but as exactly what she had always been underneath every layer of silence. The world had tried to bury her in an artist, a survivor, a force that refused to disappear, no matter how long the darkness lasted. And when the final note faded into the rafters of that New York theater, when the applause rose and rose and refused to stop, Lorraine Harris stood center stage, finally completely undeniably seen, not by accident, not as a joke, but exactly as she deserved to be seen all along, proving once and for all that some voices, no matter how thoroughly the powerful tried to erase them, simply refused to stay silent forever. Lai Theoroa. Bạn nói đúng, mình kiểm tra lại thầy Pot năm vừa rồi, khoảng 2.300 đến 2.500 tư vấn thiểu so với yêu cầu 4.000 đến 4.500 từ. Mình xin lỗi vì lặp lại đúng lời cũ dù bạn đã nhắc nhở. Mình sẽ viết tiếp phần bổ sung ngay để nối liền vào part 5 đạt đủ độ dài. Bạn muốn mình viết tiếp luôn không? Okay, strategize narrative expansion by repositioning content before conclusive ending. Strategize narrative expansion by repositioning content before conclusive ending. Mình viết phần bổ sung để chèn vào giữa part 5 sau đoạn gặp Asha Carter, trước đoạn 6 months later. Giúp đủ độ dài. That night after the press conference ended and the auditorium lights dimmed, Lorraine sat with Aisha in a small office down the hall, the young woman's folder finally spread open on the desk between them. Aisha's hands trembled as she pulled out contract pages covered in yellow highlighter, the same exhausting research Lorraine herself had once done alone at her kitchen table, except this time there was someone sitting across from her who actually understood what she was looking at. They told me the clause about master's reversion was standard industry language. Aisha said, her voice tight. I didn't have a lawyer who specialized in music contracts. I just had a general practice attorney who charged by the hour and ran out of time to really dig into it before my case got dropped. That's not an accident, Lorraine said quietly. That's the entire design. They count on artists not having access to specialists. They count on exhaustion winning before truth does. How did you survive it? Aisha asked. 19 years of knowing and not being able to do anything about it. Lorraine considered the question for a long moment, the weight of it settling differently now that she was being asked rather than asking it of herself in the dark. Some days I didn't survive it well at all, she admitted. There were years I couldn't listen to my own music without feeling sick. There were nights I genuinely believed I deserved what happened to me, that maybe I wasn't talented enough to have kept what I'd built, that maybe the silence was simply the industry correcting itself. She paused. It took a long time to understand that believing that was just another way the system kept me quiet. Aisha wiped her eyes. I keep waiting to feel angry instead of just sad. Is that wrong? It's not wrong, Lorraine said. Anger comes in its own time if it comes at all. What matters is that you're here now instead of disappearing the way they expected you to. By the time Aisha left that night, her case had been formally accepted by Renata's team, the first of what would become 17 over the following months, each one chipping away methodically at the same machinery that had once swallowed Lorraine whole. Weeks turned into months, and the foundation's reach expanded faster than even Charles Whitfield had anticipated. Lorraine found herself splitting her days between legal strategy meetings and quiet one-on-one conversations with artists who reached out, some through official channels, many simply through letters mailed to the foundation's small Stamford office, handwritten accounts of contracts gone wrong, royalties that vanished, careers extinguished without explanation. One afternoon in March, a letter arrived from a man named Curtis Boyd, a jazz musician in his 70s living in New Orleans, his handwriting shaky but determined. He described losing his masters to the same network of liquidation sales decades earlier, watching his music get licensed for commercials and films over the years, while he received nothing too old and too tired to fight a battle he'd long assumed was unwinnable. Lorraine called him personally. Mr. Boyd, my name is Lorraine Harris. I think we might have very similar stories. The conversation lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, Curtis was crying on the phone, and so was Lorraine, two strangers separated by decades in geography, but bound together by the exact same machinery that had quietly profited from both their silences. I never thought anyone would believe me, Curtis said. I figured I'd just go to my grave knowing what happened and nobody else ever would. Not anymore, Lorraine said firmly. Not while I have anything to do with it. Curtis Boyd's case became one of the foundation's most significant victories, his masters fully restored just before his 78th birthday, the licensing royalties from the previous decade recalculated and returned with interest substantial enough to finally pay off his home and leave something behind for his grandchildren. When the settlement was finalized, Curtis insisted on flying to New York specifically to thank Lorraine in person, arriving at the foundation's office leaning on a cane, his eyes wet before he'd even said a word. You gave me my name back, he told her, gripping her hands tightly. Do you understand what that means? At my age, I get to die knowing the truth finally came out, instead of dying, wondering if anyone would ever believe me. Lorraine held on to his hands and felt something settle inside her chest. A kind of quiet, hard-won peace that no amount of applause or vindication at that Greenwich Gala had quite managed to provide. This was different. This was the work continuing past the spectacle, past the headlines into something that actually changed lives one at a time in rooms far quieter than ballrooms, far less glamorous than press conferences, but infinitely more meaningful. Not every case ended in victory. There were setbacks too, a promising claim that collapsed when key documents had been destroyed years earlier, a young artist who grew so discouraged by the slow pace of legal proceedings that she withdrew entirely, choosing to walk away rather than relive the trauma in deposition after deposition. Lorraine carried each of those losses heavily, staying up some nights, replaying conversations, wondering if there was more she could have done, more comfort she could have offered. "You can't save everyone," Raymond told her gently during one of those difficult weeks, finding her in the foundation office long after everyone else had gone home, papers scattered across her desk. "You're not failing them by not being able to fix every broken thing in this industry single-handedly." "I know that intellectually," Lorraine said. "It doesn't make the nights any easier." "It shouldn't," Raymond said. "If it ever gets easy, that's when you should worry." Spring gave way to summer, and the foundation's work began drawing attention beyond just the entertainment industry. Legal scholars started referencing the Harris precedent in cases involving athletes whose endorsement contracts had been similarly exploited, in cases involving authors whose publishing rights had vanished through nearly identical liquidation maneuvers. What Lorraine had started as a deeply personal reckoning had become, almost without her fully realizing it happening, a blueprint other industries were beginning to study and apply. Victoria reached out twice during those months, each time tentatively, each time offering some small piece of information she'd uncovered while sorting through what remained of her old life. Financial records, names of other executives who'd participated in similar schemes across different labels, contacts within the industry who might be willing to speak if approached carefully. Lorraine accepted the information without warmth, but without coldness, either recognizing slowly that redemption, if it existed at all, would have to be built case by case, action by action over a much longer timeline than either of them could control. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Victoria said during their second conversation, sitting across from Lorraine in a quiet coffee shop. Neither of them would have ever imagined sharing a table in a year earlier. "I just want to be useful in whatever small way I actually can be." "Useful is a good place to start," Lorraine said. "Forgiveness isn't something I owe anyone on a timeline, but useful I can work with." By August, the foundation had grown enough to require its own dedicated staff beyond Michelle and the small legal team, and Lorraine found herself for the first time in 2 decades signing a lease on an actual office space, hiring her own employees, building something with her own name attached to it that had nothing to do with cleaning other people's houses, and everything to do with making sure fewer people ever had to feel as invisible as she once had. It was on a Tuesday afternoon in September, sorting through the week's intake of new cases, that Lorraine received the call that would lead directly into the evening of the benefit concert, Charles Whitfield confirming the date, the venue, the lineup of artists eager to participate, the symbolic significance of holding it almost exactly 1 year after that fateful Greenwich Gala had first cracked everything open. "It feels important," Charles said, "to mark the anniversary with something that builds rather than something that simply remembers." "I agree," Lorraine said. "Let's build something worth remembering."